It is nearing the third millennium of the Third Age on Middle-earth. Though there has been peace in the larger parts of the world for much of this time, the dark evil of Sauron is stirring once more. The great servant of Morgoth has returned to the black lands of Mordor. The wise of Middle-earth have grown troubled, for they know that should the enemy find the One Ring, the omnipotent source of much of his power of old, he would become nigh insurmountable. The great tale of this last saga of Middle-earth begins in the legendary book The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. This will be a recap strictly of the events in the book, not the movie retelling by Peter Jackson, and marks the start of the most iconic fantasy franchise in all of literature. Let's dive in. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. Hobbits were a humble, gentle folk who lived simple lifestyles. They mainly dwelled in what used to be the lands of Arnor, and were uninvolved in the great events of ages past with few exceptions, one being Bando Barras-tûk going to battle against a legion of orcs. Another great exception was a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins. He was a well-respected, well-off hobbit who stayed out of trouble, mischief, and most importantly, adventures of any sorts. As a normal hobbit, he was slightly smaller than a dwarf, not graced with the magic and long lives of the elves, but moved silently on his feet and could make nary a sound when he chose. Bilbo's mother was Belladonna Took, and the Tooks were notorious in the past for going on adventures and being up to no good in general. One fine morning, Bilbo was outside his front door smoking his pipe when along came the wizard Gandalf the Grey. Bilbo did not initially recognize the old family friend of the Tooks, who was looking for someone to partake in an adventure. The hobbit stubbornly refused to entertain the request, eventually shooing Gandalf away and rushing back inside to the comfort of his home. But Gandalf betrayed no expression on his face, and instead carved a symbol into Bilbo's door without him noticing. Thus it was the next day that Bilbo heard a knock on his door. He assumed it to be Gandalf, but was surprised when it was a dwarf that introduced himself. His name was Dwalin, and Bilbo was absolutely befuddled. Even more shocking was the arrival of a second dwarf with a long white beard named Balin. More dwarves showed up, and Bilbo soon met, much to his despair, Fili, Kili, Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, Gloin, Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur. Gandalf himself then arrived, as well as a final dwarf named Thorin. 13 would be their company, though Bilbo would need some strong convincing still. After a ravenous dinner, the dwarves sang a song of old, which seemed to reference an old kingdom filled with dungeons and treasures. As Bilbo listened, a small spark of desire seemed to light up within him, and he almost felt compelled to join in on their quest. But the urge was quickly suppressed, and he sat down as Thorin began to address the company. As soon as he began to speak about dangerous deeds and daring adventures, Bilbo let out a loud shriek and had to be calmed by Gandalf. The dwarves became apprehensive about including Bilbo in the company, for Gandalf had endorsed him as a reputable burglar for some mysterious task. Gandalf then took charge, showing them all a large map. It showed a large mountain, which Bilbo also learned was the current residence of a great dragon named Smaug. Thorin was shown the existence of a secret way into Smaug's lair and a key by which to open that hidden door. For Smaug dwelled in the Lonely Mountain, the ruins of the great dwarven kingdom of Erebor. It was the inheritance of Thorin Oakenshield, whose father and grandfather were ousted from by Smaug. Many great dwarven treasures were lost, and the kingdom had fallen to ruin. After the fall of Erebor, Thorin had led the remnants of his people in a nomadic existence. They fought long and grievously with the orcs of the deep underground, but Erebor remained out of their reach, Smaug unassailable. But Gandalf over time had grown to worry about Smaug and a great many other things, for Sauron, ancient servant of Morgoth, was stirring in Middle-earth again, and should the enemy gain the allegiance of Smaug, his might would be too great to overcome. But Thorin's grandfather, had been slain by the infamous orc Azog, and his father Thrain had disappeared. Gandalf revealed he had come across Thorin's father in the prison of the Necromancer, where he had been given the key and map. Thus, the company was assembled, but after the dwarves left, Bilbo fell into a deep sleep and woke up to find them all gone. Gandalf showed up and then hurried him along. And just like that, Bilbo Baggins, against the better part of his judgment, was on an adventure that would change the course of the history of Middle-earth. Bilbo settled into the routine of traveling on the road, but soon the company realized that Gandalf had mysteriously disappeared, his whereabouts unknown. It soon began to rain, and the company then came across a distant red firelight. They ventured close and decided to send their burglar Bilbo ahead to investigate more. Upon creeping closer, Bilbo came across 3 large trolls. He decided to try and steal a treasure to bring back to the dwarves, but on his first attempt was discovered. Now the trolls were not the brightest of beings, and after some quick talking by Bilbo, quickly began to fight amongst themselves over what to do with him. The dwarves then showed up to rescue Bilbo, but after a scuffle were captured and put in sacks to be cooked. Bilbo eluded the trolls, hiding in a nearby brush. Unknown to everyone, Gandalf, however, had quietly returned. Seeing the danger the dwarves and Bilbo were in, he threw his voice around the clearing, causing them to fall into bickering once more. By now it was nearly sunrise, and the trolls were then interrupted by the booming voice of Gandalf. "Dawn take you all, and be stoned to you." And golden light peeked through the trees, and Gandalf emerged and the trolls all turned to stone. The dwarves were freed, and they then discovered the trolls' cave. Bilbo himself took a knife, which was effectively a short sword for one his size, from the loot. Gandalf then gathered the company, and decreed they were to set out for Rivendell. After several days, they reached the Misty Mountains and passed into the elven haven of Rivendell, where Gandalf looked to meet with Elrond Half-Elven. There they stayed for 2 weeks, and learned some of the blades they had plundered from the trolls were actually from the ancient kingdom of Gondolin. Elrond also looked at their map and translated its runes. "Stand by the grey stone when the thrush knocks, and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole." So off they set again, on a long and winding journey. It was rife with danger too, and on one high mountain pass they were beset by a great thunderstorm. It was tall stone giants, hurling boulders at each other. Fili and Kili were sent ahead, and returned to lead them to a dry and supposedly safe cave. However, later that night, as the company slept, a great passage opened up, and they and their horses were taken by goblins of the mountains. They were taken to the large and terribly ugly Goblin King, who detested the elves and dwarves. He reeled upon seeing an elven blade, and ordered they be taken away and killed. He lunged at Thorin, but suddenly all the torches and lights went out. Bilbo saw a sword flash and cut down the Goblin King, and a voice in the darkness, which turned out to be Gandalf, urged the company to follow him and escape. As they fought their way forward, Bilbo at the back was grabbed at by the pursuing goblins. He fell, hitting his head, and was knocked out. Bilbo Baggins then awoke alone in a cold, dark tunnel. He found a lone, cold metal ring and placed it in his pocket. Then he drew his blade and strode forwards. Down further into the earth his path went, until abruptly he came across an icy cold underground lake. And though he did not know it yet, the creature Gollum had noticed his arrival. The pale, gangly Gollum sprung out of the shadows and confronted Bilbo. The bewildered hobbit then entered a contest of riddles with Gollum. Back and forth they went, unable to trick the other, until at last Bilbo asked a frustrated Gollum his final riddle. "What's in my pocket?" Gollum, to his dismay, could not guess that the thing in Bilbo's pocket was, in fact, the golden ring that he had found in the caves. Now unknown to Bilbo, the ring had originally been in Gollum's possession, and it granted him the ability to become invisible upon donning it. Gollum then planned to use this ring to get bitter revenge against Bilbo, but was aghast upon discovering that the ring, his precious, was lost. Gollum quickly grew suspicious of Bilbo, for his heart was dark and quick to assume the worst. He leaped at Bilbo, who scurried away. He put on the ring, becoming invisible and watching as Gollum ran past his hiding place. He followed Gollum down the twisting caves, until at last Gollum stopped in front of the way out. Bilbo then brought up his sword to kill Gollum, but pity and sympathy for the creature overcame him. Instead, he leaped clear over Gollum, and ran out to the cries of Gollum cursing the name Baggins. On Bilbo ran, remaining invisible thanks to the ring. He weaved through goblins and at last escaped the mountains. Bilbo then found Gandalf and the dwarves again, telling them of his escapade but nothing of the ring he'd found. Gandalf guessed Bilbo was hiding something, but decided not to press for details. Thus they set out once more, until the howls of wild wargs were heard in the distance. They climbed up trees to escape the evil wolves, and Gandalf lit several pine cones ablaze by magic and created a ring of fire around them. All this commotion, meanwhile, was overheard by the Lord of Eagles. The eagles thus flew out just as the goblins emerged from the mountains and confronted the company as well. Gandalf, Bilbo, and the dwarves were rescued by the eagles, who fell upon the wargs and goblins in a vicious attack. The eagles took them farther south, but would not venture into dwarven realms or the lands of men for fear of being attacked themselves. Soon after being dropped off on a great rock, Gandalf told them he would have to depart in a couple days. He told them to seek the maker of the steps on the rock, who was a friend of his. They came across a courtyard with a high wooden gate, where inside was a massive man with a great black beard. His name was Beorn, and he had the power to shapeshift into a great bear to protect his land. So the company dwelt with Beorn for several days, and learned now that goblin patrols, working with wargs, had issued from the misty mountains searching for them. Beorn resupplied them, and advised them to take the path through the Mirkwood. Though out of the way of the goblins, it was full of dark, mysterious enchantments that caused one to become easily lost. There, Gandalf left them for an important errand, advising them at all costs to not stray from the path. And so they entered the Mirkwood, the air heavy and the light gloomy and dark. It was an eerie place, with almost no sunlight breaking through the trees at all. On and on they went, the forest suffocating them. Eventually, Bilbo swore he could see glowing red eyes watching them. The company walked for days in the Mirkwood, until they came across a stream of black water. There Bilbo spied a boat across on the far bank, and they managed to pull it towards them. The company crossed the stream, but a dark creature burst through the party and barreled over Bombur, and he and the boat tumbled into the stream. The dwarf was saved, but the boat was lost and Bombur had fallen under a deep sleep and had to be carried. A white deer appeared before them, which unknown to Bilbo and the dwarves was a sign they were reaching the eastern border of the Mirkwood. But they had no way of knowing this, and their spirits grew ever lower. Bilbo climbed up a tree to look at their path forward, but could not see the edge of the forest. On and on they went, and Bombur eventually woke up but had no memory of their adventures since the first dinner at Bilbo's house back in the Shire. He told them of a dream of a great feast, with a woodland king and a crown of leaves. Balin then spied twinkling red lights in the distance. Their minds dulled by the dark magic of the Mirkwood, the dwarves and Bilbo rushed towards them. But the lights suddenly vanished, and in the pitch-black darkness they lost the path. The lights then returned, and Bilbo alone was sent to investigate. But they disappeared again, and Bilbo fell into a similar sleep as Bombur, but was able to be reawakened quickly. Again the lights appeared, as well as the king from Bombur's dream. But they abruptly vanished yet again, and Bilbo was separated from the dwarves. He fell asleep and became captured in a large web. The hobbit awoke to a massive spider moving to ensnare him in a cocoon. Coming back to his senses, he drew his sword and slew the dark creature, but fell to the forest floor below. Bilbo set out to find the dwarves, and named his sword Sting. By sheer good luck, he walked in the correct direction of the dwarves, and slipped on his ring to become invisible. He found himself able to understand the language of the spiders, who planned to eat his friends. So Bilbo gathered several stones and hurled them at the spiders, dancing away from them as they searched for their assailant. He sang at them as well, and led them far away from the dwarves before doubling back. Bilbo took off his ring and began freeing the dwarves, but the spiders returned before 5 of the company could be cut down. So Bilbo donned the ring once more, and harried the spiders as cover while the dwarves escaped and fled. They managed to escape before coming to the same area where the elven fires had been, where Bilbo at last told them of his magic ring. He was praised many times over, but the dwarves soon realized that the path was lost, and that in the chaos Thorin Oakenshield had vanished. Unknown to them, Thorin had been captured by the Wood Elves who lived in Mirkwood. The elves took him to their king, who threw him in prison. For the elves and dwarves were unfriendly towards each other, the result of an ancient feud over a long-forgotten treasure of old. Thorin was well aware of this conflict, and thus refused to tell the elves of the nature of his quest. By chance, the elves also discovered Bilbo and the rest of the dwarves, and quickly captured them and brought them to the king. But Bilbo managed to slip away, and put on the ring and followed them in secrecy. The rest of the dwarves were imprisoned for disturbing the feast lit by the red lights of the elves. And so Bilbo became resigned to living a life in hiding in darkness for a long while, daring to sneak out with elven hunting parties to find a way out of the woods. Eventually, he was able to find Thorin's cell and relay news of the recent events to the leader of the company. The dwarves as a whole then waited for Bilbo to devise a means of escape. The Hobbit investigated the deeps of the Elven Kingdom, and learned of some trap doors below the palace. There the elves received barrels of wine, sent by the way of the rivers. So Bilbo waited, and it was not long before fortune smiled upon him again. For the chief of guards to the cellars was tempted to try a new shipment of wine, and became drunk and fell asleep. Bilbo stole his keys and freed all the dwarves. They scurried to the empty barrels, and escaped when they were pushed into the river. The dwarves were snugly inside their barrels, but Bilbo was forced to leap desperately and grab onto one at the last moment, for he had miscounted the number he needed. Eventually, however, the barrels were steered by the waters towards Lake Town, a place of men. As they floated closer, Bilbo saw in the distance the lonely mountain at last, the desolation of Smaug and birthright of Thorin. At this time, Gandalf had also learned of the quest's progress, and was rushing towards them for aid. Lake Town, or Esgaroth, itself was a remnant of the men of Dale, wealthy traders fallen into ruin at the coming of Smaug. Those glory days were long gone and hardly remembered, though some men of the Dale still sang of the return of the line of Durin. And the dwarves arrived at their shores, where Bilbo freed them all. They strode into Lake Town, where Thorin announced his presence as the heir of Thrain and Thror. News of their arrival spread rapidly, and they were soon brought before the master of the town. Lake Town eagerly welcomed the company, who were enthusiastically treated as saviors. Yet after several days of festivities, the heart of Thorin turned once more to Erebor, and they set out at last for the Lonely Mountain. They reached its outskirts and began searching for the hidden door. Bilbo and Balin, Fili, and Kili were sent to scout the front gates of Erebor, where they found the wide valley of Dale and the ruins of its old town. By now it was winter, with the last light of Durin's day rapidly approaching. The company was able to find the hidden door, but soon ran into the issue of it being a smooth face of stone with no keyhole. They became dismayed, but then the sun set, and Bilbo noticed that as the moon rose, the last light of Durin's day hit the door and it now seemed to be hollow. For a thrush began knocking a rock against the door, and a small hole soon appeared a meter off the ground. Thorin drew his key and thrust it in, and the way into Erebor was opened. Now the dwarves turned to Bilbo, the burglar of the company. Cursing his newfound boldness with all these adventures, Bilbo eventually saw a glowing red light in the distance, and a rumbling noise that seemed like a great beast snoring. There he lay, a vast red-golden dragon, fast asleep. A thrumming came from his jaws and nostrils, and whiffs of smoke, but his fire's low in slumber. It was Smaug, asleep surrounded by the wealth of the dwarven treasures. The hoard was vast and took away Bilbo's breath, and he snatched a great cup and ran back to the dwarves, careful not to stir the dragon. His return was met with great excitement by the dwarves, but Smaug awoke soon after and was quick to realize one of his treasures was stolen. And his roars echoed to the dwarves outside, and they quickly moved to flee for cover inside the mountain. Smaug erupted out the front gate and chased them into their secret tunnel, but he could not follow them down that narrow path, and there they hid as Smaug returned to his hoard, hate burning in his heart for the theft. The problem still lay with how exactly to bring down Smaug, so Bilbo volunteered to venture inside to see if the dragon had any weak spots. But upon reaching that dread chamber, he realized that Smaug was only pretending to be asleep, and slipped on the ring just as the dragon sprung up. He knew of the involvement of the dwarves and men of Lake Town, and Bilbo flattered Smaug and introduced himself as Barrel Rider, fighting the magic dragon talk that compelled him to give himself up and doubt the integrity and honesty of his friends. Smaug would not be tricked by Bilbo's words, however, and rightfully asserted his armor and fire were far beyond the power of the company to overcome. But Bilbo was then able to spy a hollow patch on the dragon's left breast, and quickly fled back to the dwarves to relay this information. He feared Smaug would soon move against the people of Lake Town, but the topic soon turned to the treasure. For Thorin greatly coveted the Arkenstone, a magnificent glittering jewel dubbed the Heart of the Mountain and the crown gem of the old kingdom of Erebor. Then the mountain erupted, for Smaug was searching for the hidden path of the thieves, and by stealth burst out the side of the mountain and took to the skies. The dwarves and Bilbo became trapped in Erebor, and the brave hobbit decided to lead them to the hoard of Smaug. There alone he ventured in, and by chance came across the Arkenstone. So taken he was by its radiant beauty, he took it as his share of the treasure and told none of the dwarves, not even Thorin. There was no sign of Smaug returning as of yet, and the dwarves were now emboldened to keep exploring their kingdom of old. The treasures were pillaged, and Thorin began fervently searching for the Arkenstone. Bilbo was given a coat of mithril, and they made way for the southwest outpost of the mountain. Smaug, who by now had not been seen for 2 days, had flown to the town of Esgaroth. He fell upon its people, devastating their homes with evil fires. But one man, Bard of the line of Girion and Lords of the Dale, stood tall with a great yew bow and black arrows in the face of the dragon. And a thrush came to him, for the men of the Dale had long grown to understand the language of the birds. This thrush had overheard Bilbo telling the dwarves of the chink in Smaug's armor, and now told Bard. And as Smaug flew low for another pass, Bard let loose his last arrow and struck that weak spot, killing Smaug and sending him plummeting into the lake. Bard won great renown and respect among the people of Esgaroth, and he began to be called king to the chagrin and jealousy of the master of the town. All the while, Bard's heart became hardened towards the dwarves, for it was they who had awakened Smaug and brought ruin upon his people. But they were believed to be dead, and now Bard sent word to the Elven king in Mirkwood, who quickly gathered the elves and marched to the aid of Bard. Together they set out for the Lonely Mountain, looking to claim its treasures. Meanwhile, an old raven flew towards Bilbo and the dwarves on the outpost, and introduced itself as Roke, son of Kark, and as the 153-year-old king of the ravens. Roke told them of Smaug's death, and that a great host now marched to Erebor, though it seemed Bard looked for peace between elves, men, and dwarves. But Thorin's heart, by the nature of dwarves and his drive to find the Arkenstone, was now corrupted by greed for the treasure in the mountain, and was set that none of it should pass to the marauders. Roke was sent to beseech Dane, Thorin's cousin, for aid, and the dwarves began to refortify Erebor. After some days, the host of elves and men reached Erebor, and a tense standoff ensued with the dwarves, who were awaiting the arrival of Dane of the Iron Hills. Bard walked forwards to parley, but was sternly rebuffed by Thorin, who had grown to desire the lost Arkenstone more by the day. He declared the mountain to be besieged, and that war was now upon them. Days passed, and though the dwarves were bound by loyalty to the will of Thorin, Bilbo had grown to doubt the intentions of the king, so he slipped out of Erebor in the middle of the night and came to the audience of Bard and the Elven King. Gandalf also arrived and praised Bilbo for his deeds. The hobbit presented them the Arkenstone, hoping it would bring Thorin to see reason, and snuck back into Erebor. The following morning, Bard and the Elven King presented the Arkenstone to a befuddled Thorin. Bilbo confessed to giving the jewel to them and was cast out from Erebor. Then Dain of the Iron Hills at last arrived and bade the elves and men of Dale to stand aside or risk open battle. But then a dark, rumbling cloud came from the north. It was an army of orcs, led by Bolg son of Azog, the killer of Thror. For they had also learned of the death of Smaug and had set out from Gundabad, spurred by a deep hatred of dwarves stemming from the wars after the fall of Erebor. Thus began the dreadful battle of the five armies, with the dwarves joining the elves and men against the forces of orcs allied with wargs. The elves manned the south of Erebor, with Bard and his men taking its east. The orcs scaled the mountainside, falling upon the vastly outnumbered defenders. Though the might of elves, men, and dwarves of Dain was fierce, they were driven back as the battle dragged on. Then out of Erebor, there came Thorin and his company. Hood and cloak were gone. They were in shining armor, and red light leapt from their eyes. In the gloom, the great dwarf gleamed like gold in a dying fire. Leading a deadly counterattack, Thorin drove straight for the guard of Bolg, but could not break it. The tide began to turn once more, and Bilbo fell into despair. But then the eagles came, flying in from the north. Bilbo was knocked out and reawakened to find himself alive and the battle over. He was brought to Gandalf and a dying Thorin, who looked upon the hobbit once more with the gaze of a dear friend. Farewell, good thief. I go now to the halls of waiting to sit beside my fathers, until the world is renewed. Since I leave now all gold and silver, and go where it is of little worth, I wish to part in friendship from you, and I would take back my words and deeds at the gate. Bilbo fell to his knees as Thorin Oakenshield died, and learned from Gandalf that the eagles had also arrived with Beorn, who bore a wounded Thorin out of the battle and had slain Bolg himself. The orcs suffered massive casualties and were driven away, hunted by the eagles and elves of Mirkwood. Thorin was buried in the deeps of Erebor with the Arkenstone and his glowing sword Orcrist. Dain became the new king under the mountain, but Fili and Kili, cousins of Thorin, had also fallen in battle. To Bard, a small portion of the treasure, though still a vastly wealthy amount, was given to rebuild Dale. Bilbo himself was given 2 chests, and with a heavy heart began to set back out for the Shire. He bid farewell to the dwarves and returned home, along the way resting at Beorn's house, where the surrounding wilds had become a safe haven for men. He was also accompanied by Gandalf, and they passed through Rivendell, where it was revealed that the wizard and his errands had driven the necromancer out of the south of Mirkwood, and the darkness on those woods was lifted. Bilbo came back to the Shire to find all his possessions being auctioned off, however, for he had been presumed dead. Life returned to normal, and though Bilbo was now socially ostracized for his very public adventure, he was more content than ever. After some years, he was visited by Gandalf and none other than Balin. He learned Bard was now the sole lord of a thriving dale and had renewed friendships with the elves and dwarves. And Bilbo was glad, and Gandalf then turned to him. You are a very fine person, Mr. Baggins, and I am very fond of you. But you are only quite a little person in a wide world after all.